Resources, Finance, and Property Committee to order. The first item on the agenda is Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Public comment. Nobody has approached me or the clerk. Therefore, we will move on to the approval of the minutes of the February 8th meeting, which are in your packet. What are your wishes?
Move to approve, Mr. Chairman.
Been moved. Is there a second? Moved by Gibbs, seconded by Hart to approve. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. We'll move on to operational functions. Approval of claims and question cost. And we've had a little pre-meeting discussion about font size and columns and appropriateness. Can we customize this going forward to get rid of?
Yeah, actually, we have Jennifer Durrett. She's one of our. We have our consultant, and I've actually ran just the straight up report into Excel. So what I've done already is sent her an email. And so if you have some other items that you are looking for, one would, yeah, we'll get her all fixed up.
Right. I think what's critical is if we know, you can't even read it when you print it out. But if we could limit it to, who the vendor is, what the purpose is, what the type is, in the amount. I think that would probably suffice because these are all within a date certain in a check run. Are there other bits of information that the members would like to see relative to our review of the claims and the checks? Less is more in terms of our ability to really review it. So if we could get it down to 4 or 5 columns, it would be wonderful. And Kurt, do you want us to postpone this pending receipt? I did have a chance to scroll through it. Do others? What are your wishes relative to the claims and question cost? We just had a lot of questions on the format, to the point where we thought we might bring back Kayenta.
Well, that was going to be my motion, but short of that, I'll make a motion to approve the claims and question costs.
Is there a second? Seconded by Leahy. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, we'll move on to item 2, FCC Broadband Expansion Grant Application, Frontier. Consider support and match. And this is Jack Phillips from Frontier has joined us on WebEx. We received a call yesterday from Frontier, and they indicated that they were in the process of developing a grant application for the $14.1 million of available funding through the Public Service Commission. Those applications are due this week. And he was looking for both a letter of support and a potential match from the county. And it started out as one application, and I think upon further review and discussion, it's now 2 applications. Jack, are you online, and would you like to just give us a high-level overview of what you're looking for? Or we can do that summary, but I think I'd rather have it come from you if you're available.
Sure. Yeah. Yes. Hi. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we've got 2 projects, and I apologize for the last minute on this. There's a lot of applications in different states coming up, and this one came up kind of at the last minute as part of a larger planned build that we have. It is split into 2 projects, and there aren't a lot of grant eligible locations within these projects. One has 117 grant eligible locations. The other has 74 grant applications, but we are trying to fill in with our own funding. These will be to kind of fill in pockets of our planned builds in within those general areas. So the areas that I did provide a map, those maps show only the grant eligible locations. Since we've talked, I think last we have upgraded the speeds that we're offering to 2 gigabit symmetrical service. We were the first company to offer on a nationwide basis in our fiber footprint last February 2022, 2 gig symmetrical service. And at the end of January this year, we announced that we're offering 5 gig symmetrical service in all of our markets. So, and again, it's a scalable network. And the reason when I called John, I initially was asking for, letters of support are important, but given the limited amount of funding that's available, and I told him, we're really not here for the money. We're here for support, something that we can take to the Regulatory Commission, the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, to demonstrate that we truly have support. And we found in, other cases that, the amount, certainly a high amount is great, but in some cases it's necessary to actually justify a project. But in this case, the thing we're really asking for is sort of a token that amount of support, $10,000 for each of the applications, to use as a demonstration, a tangible demonstration that the county is behind the projects.
So this, again, it's on a short turnaround with the applications due. I've had, subsequent to the discussions with Jack, Jerry has looked at it, and the numbers have changed. Yesterday we were looking at a different set of numbers. I think that they've been refining it based upon the PSC coverage maps. If you ask for funding in areas already served, they typically won't fund it, so they've narrowed the scope. Based upon what we did the last PSC grant round, we provided $235 per unit served as a match. The request today, based upon the 117, is $85.47, and based upon the 74 would be $135, both below that $235 level that we had done. In the past, we've funded this through either the initial $250,000 KIP, capital improvement allocation from 2 years ago, or the use of ARPA dollars. We don't have the luxury of running it by the county board in order to get the grant application in, but we can convey our support. We do have available to us the Finance Committee's contingency fund, which we could use to match it in a timely manner and meet the obligation and have the authority to make that commitment today. But we'll leave it up to you. This fills in some of those gaps. And the project is a much bigger project, but the application is only for those areas that are underserved, meet the definitions under the PSC. And there was also discussion about potentially, I think it's 5 gigabyte service eventually. Jack, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, we're actually offering that today on all of our fiber networks. We announced that, I think it was either January 30th or 31st of this year. We made an announcement that we're now offering 5 gig symmetrical service. And actually, the network is designed without even any upgrades to provide 10 gigs. So symmetrical, again, there isn't a commercial request for need for it now, so we don't have the equipment provision for that, but it is scalable. We are well positioned to offer 10 gig symmetrical service when there's demand for it. So so we would be, and as well as the projects that we we previously got approved. Those will be launched at, we previously said 2 gig symmetrical. Those will be launched at 5 gig symmetrical.
And again, the one project deals with towns of Wausau, Easton, and
And Weston.
Weston, and the other deals with.
Yeah, and I'll provide a little bit of a caveat there that we are struggling a little bit in terms of how to throw those counts into the communities. Those are based on zip codes, which don't necessarily match up with our exchange boundaries, nor do they line up with municipal boundaries. But I guess just a caveat there that when I provided that breakdown, it was based on the zip code of those locations. But nevertheless, very close to what we I think the municipal boundaries of those areas.
All right. Are there any questions? Cody?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to know how much was in the Finance Committee's contingency fund, if that's what we're thinking of
If you
using
could
that
speak
for
up
matching.
into the mic.
I wanted to know how much was in the contingency fund?
50,000.
Okay, and we haven't spent any of that yet, right?
John, if I can, Jack, I just want to clarify what we put in the packet was the information we got 2 days ago, and that was for one project with about 300 properties and the other one with about 325. But the next day, when you sent us a little more detail, we don't have that in the packet, but it's for one project is 117 addresses and the other one is 74 or 79, something like that. I just want to clarify that's what you're bringing forward potentially to the PSC grant, right?
It is, yes. And again, we're doing some last minute trying to determine some of those locations, whether they were grant eligible or not eligible. And so the numbers we have there, the 117 and the 71,
74?
74 are what we believe to be underserved locations.
And this would be similar to some of the projects that we funded through Serenity or Wittenberg-Tell in the past. And it's just, it's an incremental filling in of some of those gaps. Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess not really a question for Jack, but a question possibly for Christie and or the administrator. Practicality-wise, we could commit using the Finance Committee contingency today, but also I shouldn't say condition it on, but with the thought that we would go to the full board with an ARPA request to substitute ARPA in there, should these projects be funded, and use ARPA instead, and leave the finance contingency alone?
If I may, Mr. Chair, that is precisely the conversation that Committee Chair Robinson and I had, that in light of the compressed timeline, you had the ability to encumber, for lack of a better word, the dollars within your HR Finance and Property Committee contingency, but nevertheless leave you the flexibility to engage the full board at a later date if there was a better funding mechanism, if the grant application were successful.
Put it in perspective, last year, I believe the applications were due in March. Help me, and I think the final, the notification of award was in the summer, and I think the contracts came out in December. So there's a long lag between the submittal of the applications to the Public Service Commission, their review of those. One of the reasons there was $125 million available and $500 million worth of requests. I don't anticipate that, given the small pot of money, the 14.1, and the workload that many of the firms, we talked to a number of firms that they just didn't have the capacity at this time to submit another application given what they've got in the works. So I'm hoping that there's less competition for those dollars. The governor in his budget has identified $750 million for broadband expansion. We'll still be awaiting receipt of the federal funds, and we are dealing with that with the planning grant. So there are other opportunities, but this is a great opportunity for us now to advance another project. Chair Gibbs.
Just one other question, I guess, and this is probably a question for Jack. How confident are we that the identified number of properties or homes or businesses, 117 on the one project and 74 on the other, they are truly eligible and underserved?
I think we've got a pretty high level of confidence. We have seen challenges, and across states, we've had challenges of other providers. I mean, it's possible there will be some challenges. And to the extent, that if there is a challenge and some of those are carved out, we've worked, if they are in fact served, then we've been able to, accommodate by carving that out and coming back. But I guess the plan is that we would do those locations whether we get funding or not. If we get at least part of it, we'll do the entire 71 and
Gotcha. Thank you.
117. I'm sorry, 74 and 117 regardless.
Yep.
As long as we get at least some funding for it.
So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd make a motion that we support the two grant opportunities that we utilize to secure today the funding from the Finance Committee's contingency fund, with the understanding that we will later utilize or go to the board and ask to substitute ARPA funding for this project, clearly being an ARPA eligible project.
Is there a second? Second by Leahy. Any discussion? Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. And I just wanted to be clear, that was 10,000, right, in matching funds that we're authorizing?
10 for each project,
For
so it'd be
each?
20,000.
Okay.
Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. And Jack, I updated your letter and forwarded it on to administration, and we'll try to get that to you as soon as possible.
Okay. And I'd just like to say I've had regulatory and legislative responsibility for Wisconsin for many years, and I know that Marathon County, I don't want to go into a long story here, but that it's been an underserved community of ours, and we're very pleased that you've stepped up, and we're very happy to be able to bring fiber and I think world-class broadband service, after many years of a copper network that really wasn't delivering the service that the county wanted and needed. So very much appreciative of your support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate the interest in the investments. We'll move on to discussion to forward to the county board for consideration, 2024 budget process. Supervisor Hart or Administrator Leonard, or both.
All right, I can start. There are a couple of documents in your packet, and just to start with the context of what they are, we'll start with, I believe, on page,
Aye.
yeah, I actually want to start on 6 because I made some changes to page 5, but we can start on page 6. This is the document that I shared on the screen last time, and took a little bit of our discussion, didn't make too many fundamental changes really to the timeline itself, but I did add one part that was referenced, I believe, by Supervisor Hart at the meeting, and that is the last bullet, really taking the time at that budget summit, the committee of the whole budget summit, the full county board meeting, to talk about the committee jurisdiction for program modification recommendations that we take the time to, again, lay that expectation that the committees are to follow up with those, standing committees are to follow up with those discussions in the coming month to bring forward those program modification recommendations for inclusion in the budget. So that was added to make that abundantly clear. We also added some clarification relative to the timeline and the specific dates for some of the actions that are required here. Again, nothing fundamental in terms of changes. I did combine a number of steps that were really internal. That is really on the first cell, the top part of what is page 7 in your packet, that the department draft budgets are distributed, that we begin working through those initial requests and begin meeting with those department heads. Rather than separating those things out, those are all internal in nature. We really just noted those as a single action to get that completed in September. Relative to presentation of the budget, added a date for your county board meeting in September. This is I put September 26th. Certainly we can try for earlier if that's something that you'd wish to do, but you do have a meeting the same date normally as the county board voting meeting like you do today. So I listed September 26th there for that single meeting where where the presentation of the preliminary budget, the original administrator's budget, is made to not only the HR Finance and Property Committee, but really to the full board. That was, again, one of those pieces of feedback we received. You would accept the budget at that time. Relative to amendments, I just tried to provide a date by which those would be completed such that you'd have them in advance of your October 11th meeting. That's currently on your calendar, so I selected Friday, October 6th, of course, looking for clarification, or you modify that as you see fit. As it relates to that October deadline for this committee to take action relative to the budget, just for some clarity, of course, the statute is very clear with regard to publication and the notice that is required. Christie has made clear to me October 16th in the morning. That is your drop dead deadline of when she needs to have that. We, of course, would prefer your October 11th meeting to make sure publication is able to be accomplished with the local newspaper, but nevertheless, the true deadline is the 16th to make sure we can get all the things done we need to do the morning of the 16th. But nevertheless, publication is referenced there. Your public hearing, November 2nd, again, tried to provide some additional time for budget amendments based on our conversation and the feedback we've gotten through the county board meetings and just in other interactions with supervisors. What I've heard is this, again, a desire for more time for supervisors to consider amendments. If we are able to kind of hit that mark with respect to more time that the budget is with this committee, I termed the second round of amendments to be considered really to be those that might stem from the public comments that are received at the budget. The public hearing is the opportunity for the public to weigh in on the county board's budget, and that's how I termed it in terms of a timeline. So November 6th for those. That still does give you a little bit of time to review those and consider them prior to the final adoption of the budget, which on your current calendar is slated for November 9th. So that's the timeline piece. As I said, I made some just grammatical changes to the decision matrix, and I actually already have caught a number of additional ones I need to make. But it's really largely the same matrix before. Really, this idea that we would be asking, administration would be asking this committee and then the full board to essentially weigh in on these. I do need to add back in 2 or lower. In speaking with Ken Witt from St. Croix County, they essentially just rank file these. There's a recommendation. Number 1 is, say you selected, number 1 is health insurance. That's the top, status quo health insurance plan. Say you picked number 2 is employee compensation, 3 is capital reserve, 4 is position expansion or contraction, and 5 is operating expenses. You literally do it that way, and that would drive this decision matrix. So I need to add back in the language of a number or lower, because of course some of these are really dichotomous choices, 1 or 2, either, for example, on the capital reserves, either don't use them or use them as necessary. So you could, if it ranked number 4 as capital reserves, it nevertheless leads you to option 2. But regardless, you kind of see the 2 documents before you. Certainly, if you have feedback, you want me to change things, I can do that before the next county board. If you decide to move it forward, move it to county board. You can make those changes before next month's meeting, or you can take it to your next meeting for further review of any draft changes. If you have any specific questions, happy to answer them. I set for example, employee compensation, kind of the dividing line for the pay for performance allocations, you'll see is at that 3%. If you rank it a number 2 or above, you'd probably be in that 3.01% or higher in terms of an allocation for purposes of pay for performance. If it's something lower in terms of a budget priority, it would be less than 3%. So that's kind of how we structured that. Similarly with health insurance, number 1, keep the health insurance the same, or I could envision that indicating an enhancement of our health insurance. We were actually able to do that last year without additional cost for some of those enhancements. But that's the layout of the decision matrix. I don't know if you're looking for more, Mr. Chair, but the only other document that's in your packet that is new to you, Supervisor Hart put together this series of documents relative to committee jurisdiction, which would probably be the template that we would use through that committee of the whole meeting, where we talk about committee jurisdiction. This is really largely pulled from your operating rules relative to committee jurisdiction. Making sure, again, that each of your standing committees understand their role and responsibility relative to budget modifications. I don't know if you had anything, Supervisor Hurt.
Yeah, that pretty much covers everything. I think one of the main things is, I wanted to make that budget retreat kind of as painfully obvious as possible as to, letting all the supervisors know exactly how they can participate. I think that this timeline that Lance created is great, because it goes through the committees. It gives 2 opportunities for all supervisors to propose amendments. The matrix, I think, works out really well too, because it kind of simplifies something that I think a lot of supervisors struggle with, is how do you take this giant budget and condense it into broad decisions that we have to make. So yeah, I think this works out really well. I do have one question in particular on the on setting budget priorities. I just am kind of curious as to what we were thinking, and maybe this is a general question for the committee as to what that looks like. Is that going to be a resolution? Is that going to be something like our strategic plan? Maybe like a work plan type document, and how we're going to make that determination as well. Is it going to be just based off of verbal feedback that we get from committees, or is it going to be like a vote of this committee that we send on to the full board? And I think that's something we can talk about now. Thank you.
You want to take my thought? That's a great question. I'm going to call Ken Witt from St. Croix County. I assume it's a resolution. That would be my assumption, because in our process that's envisioned through this timeline, you'll see that the recommendations relative to budget priorities, the discussion starts, of course, at the Committee of the Whole Budget Summit, where we go over what those priorities, the potential priorities are. We can go over that decision matrix. explain that to the full board and certainly as well to this committee. The next step is for HR Finance and Property to bring those recommendations forward in May and also have the county board then adopt them. My sense is how you adopt things is you adopt them through resolution. And I will just, in my mind, it's the easy button to see what form they've taken. The matrix is largely the same. There are a couple nuances, but this idea of rank filing those priorities, that's a phone call I can make even yet this week. Send that over and see what Ken has to offer, because he's been very helpful with providing these documents as well. I don't know if you had a different thought, Mr. Chair.
No, I would think that would be it, and I don't think we're looking at this program, that program. It is, these are the general, sort of our budget assumptions as we're going in. These are the most important ones. If our costs remain competitive for salaries is there, we would put that up at the top. It's a iterative process. We'll probably learn and realize that we may have not done it the best we could and try to do it better the next year. But I would assume that that resolution would include some of those assumptions. So we all have an understanding health insurance is going to go up, once we get that. But I think we'll have time to work on that. But it might be helpful before we go to the county board if we could find out what St. Croix County did and what that form and format might look like, so that we don't create a false sense of or false expectations or unrealistic expectations. I would like to just point out that when we start looking at the timelines, I know this year we had some issues relative to the workload and going into the new ERP and other things, and we actually received the budget on October 12th, and we accepted it on October 12th, and on October 17th we moved it into the publication mode. So we had two meetings, which again, in this case, the September 26th meeting would be both the committee and the board receiving it, and then we would have the October 11th meeting to make that recommendation. And if we heard at the 26th that there were a lot of concerns, we could slip in another meeting in that interim. So if we were to embrace this type of a schedule. But we acted within basically 5 days last year, Wednesday to Monday. Any thoughts? Cody?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think moving forward, one of the things, and I don't know if we want to make this decision now, but I did think that it would be appropriate, and I guess I'll defer to the people who serve on the executive board or executive committee, if it would be appropriate to at least bring this to the executive committee for their education, especially because we are asking the chairs of all of these committees to put specifically those items of jurisdiction on their agendas in, May, possibly June, depending. So I thought that might be a good idea to send it there as just a broad education, and to let them know that we're kind of asking them to take on this within their committees.
So part of our presentation to the board may well be that these are the expectations that we have for committee chairs and for committee members in the board as a whole. So I think that's an important educational component. So we'll have to address that in whatever presentation we make relative to this process. Very good point. Anything else? Do we want to advance the budget process timeline to the full board? Kurt?
I was going to say, I want to thank both, everyone that Supervisor Hart and yourself and the administrator for working on this. I think what this really does is provides the educational opportunity for all of the board members, especially the new board members, a definitive date on what the expectations are and the budget process. I don't know that this is reinventing the wheel, other than it's making it clear what is actually taking place. I think a lot of this was actually, other than having the meeting of the full board and the education that didn't take place in prior year. A lot of this did still take place, but I think it will put some people at ease, understanding the process much better, and it puts a definitive, process. So I support it 100%.
So Kim raised the question of, do we need to schedule that committee of the whole, or are we intending to do that in one of our 2 April meetings? Are we going to do this as a separate one, just to let members know so that they would be here?
I would ask that it just be rolled into our educational committee, but maybe special emphasis made on, hey, this is going to be where we're talking about the budget. But I mean, and it's up to everyone else here, but I wouldn't try to make a committee of the whole, any more of a thing, but, an educational component, whether that be at the actual education meeting or if we put it into the voting meeting of the, what was that, April, where we would know that the attendance, is supposed to have everyone there.
I'm just going to caution you, if you expect to have this be on the same day as another meeting, you're going to be in for a long meeting. If we're going to be serious about this, we have to dedicate a meeting to it. So it's either in lieu of the educational meeting or in addition to. But I don't think you can do both. And if you do, you will shortchange it and you will be doomed to fail. So I think we have to make sure we dedicate the appropriate amount of time. Particularly the first time through, we're gonna stumble a little bit. But I think it's important that we make sure that we give ourselves all the appropriate time. And I think they have a separate meeting, don't they, in St. Croix? Or do they use one of their meetings?
I can follow up. I know my sense from speaking with Ken was that it's a bit of a long meeting, and that was going to be my comment to echo your point, Mr. Chair. Certainly from the perspective of board members, it would be a long meeting. My only request is we have the same issues relative to staff. If we're going to have a 4-hour meeting starting at 7 p.m., that means staff are here from 8 in the morning. A lot of them are here earlier than that, but 8 a.m. through 5, come back. So perhaps if there is a desire to schedule a special meeting during the workday, would accommodate staff better, but I fully recognize that all of you as board members, that also impacts you from a different perspective. So there's a lot of variables at play, but I can follow up with Mr. Witt as well to see kind of how long that process has historically taken in St. Croix.
We could run something too from 3 to 7. It's sort of a Chair Gibbs.
Yeah, I appreciate not wanting to put additional meetings on, but I think when you look at all of the things that we're going to be discussing and educating the board on, budgeting 101, mandatory versus discretionary in programming, and then literally funding sources alone, the different funding sources and the various programs and the various entities, whether you have dedicated funding for CPZ staff and you have different various funding sources for infrastructure, and understanding and getting the board to understand that $1 in the budget is not necessarily $1 of tax levy, is going to be critical in developing the budget and bringing the board members along. So I would caution on, and I know I don't want to add more meetings to have meetings, but I think if we're going to be serious about having education to the board and having education that's meaningful, I would suggest that we have a dedicated meeting that's exclusively on this, because I do know how complicated it can get and trying to educate 38 members and 17 new members, second time through a budget, but clearly still wanting to understand the budget and the difference between capital and non-capital and using up of reserves and stuff. I think that we owe it to them to dedicate this meeting to that. Now, the following year, I think maybe not necessarily need to be dedicated, but I think the first time through, I think we almost have to have a dedicated meeting for the time. That would be my thing, talk on it.
Any other thoughts? So I guess what I would look to the committee for is perhaps a motion to advance the 2024 budget process timeline to the board. And then we'll need to begin to do some, probably at our next meeting, talk a little bit about what topics are we going to cover at that meeting. And then we would need to nail down that date. Cody?
And then I would ask on top of that if we could send this to the executive committee as well, just for educational purposes. And I don't know if you need an exact motion or if I can just tell the chair of that committee right now if he could add that to the educational component for that meeting. Like I said, I just want to make sure we're giving a heads up to those chairs.
Other? Supervisor Leahy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to be clear, when we're passing this on to the full board, that means then the full board will be able to amend or adjust this proposed timeline? And if so, I mean, we do have some time built in before the process really starts as laid out currently, but is that going to affect this whole thing if now we're taking feedback from the full board, it's brought back to this committee, et cetera, et cetera?
I think we're laying out a process by which we will operate with the budget. I'm not anticipating we're taking it as a
Action.
resolution, but rather, I think we want to be a little bit more able to change it versus formalize it because we're going through one. So we can explain, this is how we intend to do it, this is our timelines. If you have strong objections to something, please raise it, but we're not putting it up for a rule per se, but rather operational procedures, if that makes sense. Chair Gibbs.
Yeah, I would say that we're making this, education presentation as to the budget process. Now, these are tentative times and tentative dates. The one hard thing will be the committee of the whole and the education that will be provided during there. But again, out of respect to the board and the feedback we received, this is what we're providing as an opportunity for education on the budget process. So I think, as Chair Robinson indicated, I don't know that we're going to have it up for a vote. It'll be more for education to the board. And if they have suggestions, we'll take those suggestions. But this is an opportunity to provide them what our response, HR Finance Committee's response is to the criticism that we received from the board that they didn't get enough time to deliberate on the budget. With that, Mr. Chair, I make a motion that we forward this to the executive committee and to the full board for education on the process that we're intending to use on the budget for 2024 development.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That carries. And again, I'd like to reiterate the thanks to the administrator and Supervisor Hart for their work on this, and I think it's a big improvement over where we've been, and we'll lay out a process that people can understand. All right, Energy Task Force Charter. That was sent back to us by the Executive Committee, looking for more clarification and in some cases more certainty. And I know that Supervisor Lemmer has had a number of discussions subsequent to the executive committee meeting and has a different proposal before. So are you prepared to, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I feel like I need to set the record straight. I watched the executive committee meeting when I was driving home from a conference down in the Dells, and a supervisor had mentioned a concern about green alert, and that would be needing to be clarified because that was English humor. In English, we use a metaphor oftentimes to, teach a concept, and I used that like fruit. When fruit is green, it's usually not quite ready. Maybe I should have used the word beta, because IT professionals might understand beta better than metaphors of English. But at any rate, I am really wanting to just state I have no idea how to get a charter off the ground. I have asked for some assistance, and I would really appreciate continued assistance. There were a couple of things brought up. One was, why isn't it on the strat plan or the strategic plan? And again, we could go in all sorts of directions. I don't know how battened down this needs to be, whether or not we need to focus on fuel, whether we need to focus on fleets, whether we need to focus on our ordinances or whatever. In my vision, I'm feeling like this is a way for us to take a look at our county facilities, our county buildings and campuses. I don't really expect it to be through the whole Marathon County, unless if other people want that. But in my mind, it's just a way to save money. My property tax bill is almost $1,000 a month, and my goal is to save money. And when I saw in the budget that we spent, I don't know, $400-some thousand extra on natural gas fuel, that to me means we're going to have to take that out of some funding that might take away funding for people, and I'd rather pay money for people than fuel. So I am here to save money. Yes, if we save the earth, great. I love saving the earth, but I really want to control those costs. So it does appear, though, that there are some strategic plan attachments, and Supervisor Hart had come up with a couple of ideas, so thank you to Supervisor Hart for that. But we should discuss the admin's plan, because that is a bona fide issue to bring up, and I brought that up in, I think it was January, when we did agree to move this forward, and it was, I think, said that it could work, and Deputy Administrator Holman has been helping out with that, so I think that has some merit to continue to discuss. And then he did talk about the budget process a little bit, so until we really know what our focus would be with the energy task force, I think it's hard to decide what the budget is, but I would be saying we'd be recommending things that might save money. And if they don't save money, then why do it? So, but we don't know until we study it, and that's what I'm asking for permission to do. Another criticism was the possible membership. It was too loose, so I think that would be something I'd like us to discuss today. I have ideas of who could be on, but again, I'm not married to what's on the charter. Those were suggestions, and I'm open. It's clearly, HRFP should be on it. I see attachments to infrastructure. I see attachments to all of those groups if we go in specific directions, but certainly infrastructure. And then an endpoint for this, I don't know, I mean, I'll be on this board at least through April of 2024, so maybe that's a good ending point. I don't know. And then Chair Gibbs and I talked today, and he thought that would be an appropriate time, because then it could be built into rules if necessary. So if we put a date on of April 1st of 2024 as that sunset date. But again, beta alert, I could use a hand with some of the decision-making, and I think that's what I'd like to hear from this committee today.
Okay. There were a number of concerns relative to specificity, and I think that they already have dates, and I know that at least one committee chair approached me and said that he wasn't sure that they needed to be on there. Perhaps, I don't know. The Chair Gibbs is the appointing entity subject to confirmation by the county board. And the question is whether or not we want to spell out that each committee is represented or someone with expertise in those areas should be represented, which would give a little bit more flexibility to the chair and allow him to respond to if there is not a committee that desires to have a representative. So we may want to look at making sure that all of those areas are represented. You have Environmental Resources Committee, underneath that falls Solid Waste, and underneath that falls Parks and Forestry. So you could potentially have 3 people from one committee on it, which if one of those members was a member of a different committee, all of a sudden creates, or potentially if somebody else from a different committee creates quorum or, issues. So you'll want to be careful in how we do that. But perhaps we could just say that these areas these areas should be represented in those committee appointments, in an effort to try to appoint somebody from those standing committees for reporting purposes. We could work on that. But that was a comment that I received from one of the chairs of one of the committees, or from a couple of people, actually. Other thoughts? In terms of the strategic plan, if we wanted to tie it into the strategic plan, I think we could look at providing cost-effective services. Promote cost-effective public services is one of those areas, if we wanted to reference that in the charter under Objective 12.3, while it's not specifically identified as one of the strategies or outcome measures. Clearly, this is something that we would want to tie it into. So perhaps we might want to look at tying into Objective 12.3, if that makes sense. Supervisor Hart.
Would this be an appropriate time to bring that motion forward then?
Sure.
Because then I would make a motion to add Objective 12.3, promote cost-effective public services, into the resolution creating the Marathon County Energy Task Force.
Would you want to put that under the mission and purpose? Amend the mission and purpose to include identifying or promoting cost-effective public services? Perhaps why don't we talk, well, let's talk through the items. I think probably what we're going to do today is we'll get some consensus, and then we're going to look to Mike to capture that consensus and bring it back to us at our next meeting, then forward it on to the executive committee. Because I think if we try to piecemeal it today, we'll probably look like a committee-created product, which we'll look at and say, who created this? And so if you're okay with advancing that, is it conceptually, is there anybody have a problem with trying to put 12.3 as the objective 12.3 in the resolution? All right, we'll work through consensus and then get a draft. Go ahead.
I just want to see if I understand the attempt is to capture within the resolution creating the task force that you believe it aligns well with the strategic plan.
Okay.
As opposed to, and maybe I interpreted some of the feedback differently. One of the things that resonated with me was the idea that the strategic plan could be amended to capture the work of this task force, which is where I thought you were going, Mr. Chair, with the outcome measures on 12.3. There are 3 of them, a number of which are accomplished already. And there are some amendments to those outcome measures, one of which Supervisor Hart drafted relative to turnover. You could add an outcome measure that, as Supervisor Lemmer referenced, by April 1, 2024, this task force would deliver a report containing a series of recommendations to the county board of supervisors relative to controlling energy costs for the county budget or something to that sense. Then you would have the direct tie to, you'd be amending essentially through a resolution the strategic plan while also creating the task force itself.
That is a very valid, viable alternative. Chair Gibbs.
Yeah, I think, if we look at actually including both, one, creating the additional item in the strategic plan, recognizing the work of the task force. I think the delivery date, though, for the report should be backed up a little bit and make it accelerated, and so that if the board's going to take action, it's this board that's going to take action to adopting those recommendations. Because if we wait till April 1 or March 30th, the new board would be meeting in the April time period. So my suggestion would be we move that back to February 28th, that the report is delivered to the executive committee then for their review in March, and then brought to the full board with their recommendations to adopt whatever those recommendations are. But I like including both of those ideas, one in the resolution here, but also in the strat plan. If I might, Mr. Chair, the other question that I had was, one of the criticisms was, and maybe because I was literally harping on the executive committee that 31 items on the administrator's work plan was too much. I guess I would look to the administrator for capacity issues and understanding that now we have a deputy administrator that's fully versed in the county's operations and now on board. Do we have the capacity to take on this work without taking something off, or is there something that is on the work plan that could be, or some of the things that are completed, can this be substituted in addition, so that we don't have, because I was the one that harped to the executive committee that putting more things on the work plan is really problematic for capacity issues.
Mr. Chair, I'll probably use Corp Council language in my response. I guess my response would be it depends. As I view, I view the role of administration in the work plan. I don't list all of the things we do in the work plan. Committee support, task force support is more of it's an operational responsibility we take on. What I would do if this has legs and is approved, we'd sit down as not only within administration, but we'd sit down at a department head meeting and talk about what does that staff support look like. And what I will tell you, I'm not going to be staffing this. The question is who could be doing it. And we have a couple different components of what staff support looks like. Certainly there's the part that Kim is very well versed in, and her staff in terms of agenda postings. We have other departments that do that, preparing agendas, that sort of thing, getting packets together. And then the second part is the kind of technical support of gathering information and assisting the committee in that process. And we would talk through what that might look like. I think, like the county board, conversation you just had about membership, and areas of expertise, I am fully confident that there are members in our staff across all of our departments that have expertise in this area relative to energy conservation that are outside of administration, and we would bring them to the table to do that work. So we would find a way, if I felt as though the task force was taking a considerable amount of time, I would bring that conversation to exec and we'd have a conversation about it. But, you know, I know that answer is not very helpful, the "it depends" answer, but that's how we would approach it from an operational standpoint. My hope would be it wouldn't be incumbent upon one person to assist in the entire endeavor. I would imagine it would be a couple.
Well, thank you for that. I think, you know, the other thing is that I foresee is because of the continued increased cost in energy that continues to affect county budgets, that this is incumbent upon us to look at from a budgeting standpoint. And, you know, we clearly last year allocated X dollars worth of ARPA funding to pay for the increased cost in energy. And that is one-time money funding ongoing operations. So I am fully supportive of the creation of the task force, but also understanding of some of the criticisms that came forward.
Cody?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then one of the, kind of going off on Chair Gibbs, I think that should also be included in a new draft of the resolution as well, to kind of talk about the county's ongoing energy struggles. I know some of that was included in with the ARPA funding in the budget, and you know, a number of other issues. I also think it would be helpful to include language about our own work, our own committee's work on this. I mean, this isn't something that just kind of happened this year. We've been talking about this in our work plan since August. And I think it would be helpful to kind of include that information in a resolution, like I said, a newer resolution, to kind of show the rest of the board, the executive committee, that this is something that we have been talking about for quite a while. And I also listened to that executive committee meeting, and I know the chair of this committee talked about how not only have we been talking about it since August, but the committee, even before I was on the board, has been talking about energy costs for years now. And I see this as finally doing something on that. Thank you.
Chair Gibbs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't need to, one of the things, the mission and purpose, I think one of the things that we need to make clear is that we're talking about county-owned facilities and county-owned processes and the recommendations for improvements there. We're not talking about something that we don't have authority over, and that is, you know, that was one of the, I think there was one of the concerns that was possibly thrown out there, that, you know, we're trying to move the county to something that we don't obviously have authority over what other individuals choose to do or other municipalities. But I think making it clear in the mission that we're looking at, you know, under the charter, the mission is to look at the processes, properties, and various departments that potentially could utilize, if there is opportunity for energy efficiencies.
So as we go through this, I'd like to see us just have specific dates in here instead of spring, summer, fall, winter, spring. I think we just need, it's too hard. Is it spring on the calendar or is it spring in real life? Because winter is 6 months in Wisconsin. I think if we could just get some dates and a little bit more certainty in there, and just, you know, pick out an arbitrary date and put it in, I think that would address some accountability and have some reporting. It's just easier to focus if you know what that date certain is. So what I've heard is that to look at the mission purpose to narrow that to a county-owned or controlled activities, trying to build in a tie to the strategic plan, to look at the membership and look at the dates, and modify the resolution to capture some of the historic information. And going along the lines of Cody, perhaps we should talk that this isn't a new venture, but has been discussed in the county for years. And we have done focus on energy projects in the past, and this is expanding upon those efforts. So we might want to build that resolution to capture some of that historic information. So it's not a totally new opportunity, but again, it's responding to opportunities and challenges. The opportunities are the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other things, and the challenges are just the increasing cost of fuel and the impact on fuel on the environment. So I think that we could do that. Cody, our Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. And I think speaking of timelines and coming to a final end to this, I think, and I don't know if this was Supervisor Lemmer's intention, but I think it would be helpful to say that, that there's an end date, and that the product of this task force would be to produce a report that can be disseminated to all the department heads and kind of give recommendations as to guide energy policy, not anything that would actually be policy, but just that. I think that's what the basis of this task force would be. So I think that would be helpful to include in there, that the end product with the date is going to be the production of a report. I don't know if that holds this task force to like a very specific date to produce something, but I think that would be helpful if finality is one of the concerns. Another thing that should be included in there as well is a good distinction that the task force would create recommendations for policies and not policy itself, because I know that's one of the things that has been brought up, not only with this task force, but for a lot of different bodies emanating from this county board, is that these groups are going to make policies, and no one has the ability to make policy without getting it passed through the full board. That should be well known, but apparently it's not. So I think we need to explicitly say that this task force would create recommendations that, for policies. And then I think the last little bit that we would have to talk about then is the membership for this task force, and outline exactly what our committee would feel like would be the proper membership for this.
Kurt.
Just one other thing, and we talked about timeline and setting hard dates, but let's all be cognizant of the fact that if we come up with a charter that we move to exec could first look at it would be March. So approval would be if they approved it and goes to the full board in March, it would be May before the appointments would actually take place. So, April when the appointments would take place, and the board would potentially consider those appointments at the April meeting. And so we're really looking at May before this charter actually starts to get off the ground and starts to work. And that's assuming that we get a charter to exec for its consideration in March. But I think that needs to be taken into consideration when we talk about effective dates of when we want timeline to reflect.
Cody?
And one of the ideas for that, with that in mind, is just this. I don't like how this sounds, but have the end product be a report, and whenever that is done within the term of the county board. So if we don't set a very specific date, we could just say the final end to the task force will be when the report is produced and completed and disseminated. And then, the kind of backstop to that is that the task force would obviously have to end when the county board term ends. So I think that would be a good idea if everyone's in agreement with that.
Supervisor Lemmer.
Are there specific rules for membership on a task force in our rule book?
No. You usually say X number of members to be made up of, I think one of the more prescriptive, well, when we have the metallic mining task force that is pretty prescriptive in terms of who's on it. Others are more open. So you can do it either way. You can it is what you want it to be, and the board approves. So if you want it to be, you generally you don't put names in there, but you put areas of interest or expertise that you're looking for. And you can put it a range of, well, I think what I heard is that the county board wanted specificity in terms of numbers, but you could say that these areas, as you've done in this draft, having interest in or representatives from the following, you can do that as long as there's sort of a subset. But we can play with that and bring that back at the next meeting. Cody?
And I would say let's just be definitive about that and say that there is one supervisor appointed from each of the committees outlined there in the charter. And I don't know what we do about the 1 to 2 at-large members, if that would be citizen membership or at-large for the full board. That's also up for discussion as well. But I think definitely saying that for sure a supervisor from every one of the committees listed.
And again, one of the committee chairs said, not me. So what you've got, the way it reads is currently between 5 and 7 members from any of the following. So you could say 5 from any of the following, and then it's not specific to it. It's sent up to the chair. Problem is when you go with an arbitrary one, if Kurt can't find a member of that committee, then we're in violation of our charter. So I think you might want to just say X from this range, and then leave it up to the chair to select from those areas of expertise. That was sort of the discussion we had earlier. If you're okay with that.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea. I think then moving forward, that needs to be explained to everyone to make sure that, when we say 5 to 7, that is what it means, not 5 to 7, we're just going to pick anywhere in between. Because I think that was definitely the concern, was that the language wasn't specific enough, and that we needed to select one from every group to be very, very specific. But I think I definitely agree with that, where we might not be able to find a person from every single committee, so we should give a little leeway on that. And I agree with that.
So perhaps what you're asking for is, perhaps we got to say 5 board members and 2 citizens. And then you go, and then you can look at it. That sets it at 7, which is a workable number. Kurt?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think if we set it at 5 county board members and 2 citizen members, you're clearly having the citizen members will be there, they'll be voting members, but they can't skew the outcome. Policy, elected policy officials are directing the recommendations. to the board. So I fully support that. And I think that you need to have the leeway, but I think, what we're really looking for is somebody with HR and finance and potentially tax credit understanding, zoning understanding, as far as what zoning challenges there are out there, economic development, parks and rec, and solid waste, and how those interplay. And then obviously, so I think if you set it to say 5 county board members, 2 citizen members, you're specific in the fact that you can't have effectively 3 county board members and 5 citizen, because solid waste has citizen membership, parks and rec has citizen membership. So even though you're calling for individuals on there, you're specifically saying 5 have to be county board members. So I think that gets to the point that there were, the one individual was trying to make.
Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if the administrator would be able to just, are you aware of any volunteer, any appointment applications that have come in that would be applicable to this sort of task force, or would this have to be an additional public ask or anything of that nature to make sure we're getting applicants that would be qualified?
I think that's largely a question for Kurt. Chair Gibbs, he's responsible for the appointments. But that's a great idea to look through the applications that have come in for the various appointments that we make in other contexts. So I can look at those if Chair Gibbs would like me to do so. Otherwise, if there would be a task force creation and you would like a specific advertisement put out on the county website, we could put a banner, some sort of banner on the page.
Just to follow up, this is in no way trying to add time or delay to the actual creation of the task force. So I would love an application process that would get citizen engagement who have knowledge in these subjects, but in a timely fashion that isn't adding to any sort of delays.
Thank you for the input.
It may be up to us to get the word out too.
I've already had several supervisors contact me with individual names that they have a vast array of information and knowledge in this area. But again, I think the application process, especially for citizen members, opens it up. So I like that. I like that approach.
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then I think I had one final thought on this, and I'm just trying to think ahead of future criticisms. The cost of implementing this task force would be absorbed into the administrator budget, and like the meetings would be during the day, so there wouldn't be additional staff time at night, anything like that. I just wanted to make sure that we had that all considered as well. Thank you.
I believe that the cost is absorbed into the county board budget versus the administrator's budget. And again, for sake of understanding, when it is a county board committee, it falls under the purview of the county board, and the chair has the appointment. If it's a statutory committee, it falls under the purview of the administrator for those appointments. But this is a county board. Because it's a county board task force for that, it would fall under our budget. And typically, we wouldn't have, you may have mileage, they would be able to get mileage, but generally the cost to support it would be borne by the people staffing it.
Yeah, to the specific point of, would I make a request for a budget transfer from the county board budget within the clerk's office to support if any of Chris's time went to it? The answer is no. It would be borne, as Chair Robinson said, if there's time from a department head or a staff with expertise in this area, that would live within the already existing department budget.
So I think you've captured it. Michael is nodding. So he will get us a draft. Maybe if we could get that even in as soon as you can get it out for review and not comment. If you comment only to him, so we don't have a walking quorum. And then we can bring it back at our next meeting and then hopefully advance it on to the exec committee. But I caution you not to have an ongoing discussion on it, but rather focus your comments through Mike. I learned. All right, anything else? If not, we will move on to discussion and potential action. Current and proposed impacts to Marathon County on tax increment financing. I put that on after a discussion with Chair Gibbs for two reasons. One is because it's been part of our work plan. We were looking at creating a task force, and we haven't done that. And we were looking for a little bit more direction. And then two, because there were a number of initiatives contained in the governor's budget relative to tax increment districts, extending their life and allowing them to exceed the 12% equalized valuation in provisions dealing with housing. Supervisor Marshall has a interest in this. Unfortunately, she could not be here today. She is working on a spreadsheet, she indicated, with all the current active TIFs in the county, looking at what the implications are to the county and what the life of those are. She would like to be there, but I thought we could start out with just discussing directionally where we might go with TIFs. And my understanding of the budget is that while the governor proposes, this is joint finance disposes, and the governor brings his budget in, and the legislature goes to base year doubled and builds it back up. So while the ideas are floating out there, they'll need to be added back in when Joint Committee on Finance deals with it, and there will be a series of public hearings coming up for both this discussion and the next discussion. But I've heard that loud and clear, and that's been the practice in recent years with the Joint Committee on Finance. So, Kurt, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts, but there were we put out the county's state budget, biennial budget summary, which contains on page 2 some of those changes. But do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think there's clearly a lot in the governor's budget. There's a lot of positives for counties and local municipalities. The reality is that joint finance is going to start from base budget and build their budget, and then there will be hopefully we can have some communications between the governor's office and the legislature to do the work of the state and move forward the priorities. WCA is working diligently to try to facilitate the priorities that WCA has in support for all counties. But as you had mentioned, the next thing on I think on the time frame is that the Joint Committee on Finance will have those public hearings, and I think there's one of the public hearings that's potentially going to be scheduled in the Wausau area, and so that'll be an opportunity to emphasize the importance of what we see. One of those is, I think, the emphasis on funding for local units of government, and the WCA had a lot of talks with both the governor and the legislature on the sales tax possible use, the advantages and the disadvantages. The advantages is it's tied to economic prosperity in the state. As the prosperity goes up, the sales tax collections go up, and if we're dedicating 20%, that means that shared revenue potentially would be going up. So, like I said, the hope is that there will be, communications between the two, that we can get to a mutually considered, but consideration for a budget moving forward.
As it relates to tax increment financing, I think what we had talked about was trying to get a better understanding of what the base year or base policies are. I know that there are efforts to try to expand the amount of the tax increment financing that can be used for housing from 35 to 60%, which is part of the budget, extending the life another up to 3 years, allowing communities to exceed the 12% equalized valuation. All of those have that impact where we don't, as a county, receive any revenue for that period of time. And it does have an impact on our revenues while there are investments in the communities. And Fred Schaefer from Rib Mountain would say, if not for these investments, you wouldn't have any growth. Therefore, the investment pays for itself and you really don't lose anything. And others would argue that we provide services to those expanded development opportunities. I know that Supervisor Marshall is very interested in this, and perhaps we can delay this until the next meeting when she can be here, if that's okay, without objection. All right, we will do that, and then we will then go on to the governor's budget. We included in the packet, and I think Chair Gibbs did a good job of overviewing. This is a fundamental shift. Shared revenues have been around for years, and back in the 70s, shared revenues were expanded because they phased out the tax on machinery and equipment in an effort to try to make Wisconsin more competitive. And so the state said, if you're going to lose the ability to tax machinery and equipment, we will share our revenues and our growth going forward. And that concept gets lost going forward. So we've had a relatively stagnant appropriation for shared revenues, and therefore our shared revenues have actually declined a little bit, albeit except for the utility payments that we receive because of the Weston coal facility or the generating facility. So the shift to 20% or 1 cent of the sales tax is monumental, and there are other opportunities within the budget, including referendums for increasing the county sales tax by 5% and others. We had, I represent the county and the County Ambassadors Program, which is a group that meets with the legislators 3 times during the biennium to go over the county's priorities. This was one of those. Transportation aids was another. There were some other areas that we talked to them about, and we had asked the legislators at that time if they would be willing to meet with us once the budget came out to talk about how the budget impacts the county, and there was a lot of interest on their part in sitting down with us, and whether it's Senators Falkowski, James, or Tomczyk, or the various representatives that service Schneider, Spiros, and others, there is an interest in sitting down with us and talking through what our priorities are. But again, there's a significant shift. There are, in the governor's budget, a number of little tweaks to things along the lines of levy limits, having a 2% minimum increase. And instead of relying, if your net new construction is below 2%, you would be able to increase the levy by 2%. There are some other things that could benefit us during down years. I think it was 3 years ago, 61 out of the 72 counties had health insurance costs exceeding the net new construction revenue generated. So it's important that we have tools available to allow us to cover those costs. I don't know if you've had a chance to look through that budget summary, but the only thing that's certain is that this will change, as the Joint Committee on Finance says it. But Representative Schneider was optimistic that there would be a hearing in Wausau. I think it is important for us to be there. And while they will strip out the governor's policy, it still is on the table We'll just need a majority of the Joint Committee on Finance or the caucuses to support it, and would be a good place to start. But there's $750 million for broadband expansion grants. I know that some legislators feel because the federal dollars are there, that there's no need for additional state dollars. That is short-sighted and underfunding. We may want to try to prioritize it. I know there are increases 4% increases in many types of transportation aid and things that will benefit the highway department, but certainly won't keep up with inflation based upon the costs that we've seen at the highway department. There are changes in mental health, crisis services, youth stabilization that would have a positive impact on us. And I don't know if you've got, a chance to go through it. If you would like a more detailed presentation on the budget, or if we want to try to begin to make recommendations to the executive committee as to what those priorities are. We can't do that today because it's not as an educational item, but if we wanted to do a deep dive into some of those things that would have the most impact on our budget, we could talk about that at a future meeting and then make a recommendation to the executive committee and ultimately the county board that these would be our priorities for the legislature to deal with going forward. Do you have any thoughts? Chair Gibbs.
Well, I like that idea as far as providing, at least some feedback to the executive committee, who then it can have a discussion with the full board, but also ultimately, if I or you as a representative on the, or in our discussions with legislators and discussion with WCA, feel that the sales tax issue is critical when providing additional 500,000 or 500 million of additional revenue to all units of local government. If that's our number one priority, well, I think we need to emphasize that so that when I or you, when you're on the team, ambassadors team, that we are able to articulate that on behalf of the county rather than just on behalf of ourselves. I like the idea of looking through, some of the proposals that are in the governor's budget and coming up with what are our top priorities. I think some of the things that are there are positive, but there's also some of the things that create additional challenges. Increasing the TIF, expanding TIFs in some way, shape, or form. Allowing more of the base to be in TIFs, extending the period of TIFs becomes challenging because the county, again, doesn't receive those revenues back. There was always in TIF legislation, just a prime example was, there always was a statement in the TIF legislation that said you would not have if but for. The if but for language said that you would not have this development if but for the support that's being offered. Well, I think we've gotten away from that, looking at that portion of the TIF legislation and putting any teeth into it. So I would welcome the input from this committee and prioritizing. So what are your, maybe coming back at the next meeting and coming back with what your 5 top priorities are so that we can, forward that direction at least to the executive committee.
There's the big picture items, and then there's that low-hanging fruit. There's things in there like increasing the reimbursement for private attorneys for public defender program, and the advantage of that is that it addresses needs that fall to the county. If they're successful in getting those people, then they don't look to the county. So there are some, perhaps we could ask administration, are there some low-hanging fruit that we might want to try to get behind that would have a positive impact on the county? And there are some major policy issues that would have a fundamental impact on the county's budget going forward. If we could talk about those at the next meeting. And I'm assuming that whole issue of funding, whether it's shared revenue or sales taxes, is important. But does that make sense as a policy approach? I'm seeing Allison nod yes, and Cody. So if you could give some thought, and I would ask administration in this case to give some thought as we look at this, what are the top, we can't have a complete list, but if we could identify the top 5 priorities for the county, I think that would be meaningful in our discussions, and then we could have, in addition, these items there. So if we could do that for our next meeting, that would be wonderful. And we can share with you, there are all sorts of different analysis, and when the Legislative Fiscal Bureau comes out with papers, or the Legislative Council, if they do, on various components of this, we can try to share that with you to heighten your awareness and understanding of those issues. I would imagine that the first thing that they'll do is, they'll start all over, but they'll do an analysis of what policy items are in there and what some of those big cost items are, so we can try to share that with you. And many of you are used to looking that information up anyway. Anything else? All right, so what we have done is we've asked Mike to refine the Energy Task Force Charter and resolution. We would ask that those come back at the next meeting. We will spend some time talking about where we are relative to the state budget and its implications. We will spend some time talking about tax increment financing at that meeting, and we'll deal with our normal business items at that meeting. Anything else for future discussion? All right, then the next meeting is March 8th. In item 9, would anybody like to make that motion? Supervisor Hart moves to adjourn. Is there a second? Supervisor Leahy. All those in favor of adjournment will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you.